One. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the special Simulcast of the Neil Haley Show, the Storehouse Media Group podcast, and Criminally Good with Sherrie and Jen. Appreciate it, guys. And who's our guest today?
Jayson
Well,
Blair.
thank you,
Jayson Blair, yeah.
I had this big intro all set up for you. It's like, man, you were going to be the next thing coming. But actually, Jayson is pretty interesting, guys, an author, podcaster, and life coach. And I'll let you finish the intro, Jayson.
Oh no, I mean, I think that's a
I'm joking.
relatively decent summary. My background originally actually is in journalism. That's what I did in the early part of my career. What I'm most known for is actually a scandal at the New York Times in the 2003, where I was responsible for fabricating and plagiarizing a number of stories. And that scandal, for all its upsides and its downsides, I just wrote a recent essay about it. One of the real, I mean, there were lots of downsides for the profession, lots of downsides for me, but one of the real upsides, I think, for me was the opportunity to sort of gain a little humility, but also grow. And I was, in the course of that, also diagnosed with, or at the end of it, diagnosed with bipolar disorder, which then led to my next chapter. After getting stabilized myself, I went into the mental health community first as a volunteer, but then ultimately as a clinician and a coach. And so that's where how I got to that space. And I've loved that business. I've loved that work. I do mental health work, leadership development work, but that's what also led to the podcast because some of my colleagues who were coaches had been suggesting for years because they knew one of my philosophies was that there should be no barrier to entry. So if a client came in and they could pay our normal rate, they would pay our normal rate. If you were a client and you couldn't afford it, let's say a young person who was, just out of high school and didn't go to college, or, we would charge you next to nothing. And then, people would have life circumstances like a divorce and we'd go down to zero. And my colleague said to me, you want no barriers to entry and you're always having these awesome, interesting conversations with people. Why don't you take them on the road and create a podcast which gives everyone an opportunity for free to hear these interesting conversations? And of course, because I'm a numbskull, I said to her, that's crazy. That's crazy. That's a terrible idea. Let's not do that. Anyway, she made the point for several years, and ultimately that's what led to my podcast. And it's really rooted in that idea of finding really, really interesting people to have interesting conversations with. And where it sort of like lands in the true crime space, I really think, is that, you know, I don't really believe they're true crime stories. I believe they're human stories. And when you're telling stories, like we as human beings have one thing in common, I think. We have lots of things that are sort of like similar, but we all go through suffering. And that's something we all experience. And I think the stories that we hear when it comes to true crime, when we're talking to the victim's loved ones or someone who's searching for their missing relative, we're hearing a story about suffering that sometimes when we're watching it on Dateline or we are consuming it in, an online news magazine, it doesn't feel very relatable. But when you can have a long conversation with many of these folks, you'll find that their stories are very relatable and that you can learn lessons for your life. You know, I always like to think of Jill Harrington, who's Morgan Dana Harrington's mom. Morgan disappeared she was a student at Virginia Tech. She disappeared at the University of Virginia. She was attending a concert and, Jill said to me on the podcast, and I really thought, and listening to her and her husband Dan come on, there's no way that I'm going to be able to relate to this. But she said, when you have a loss, when you're sitting there with a stack of ashes, what do you do? And well, if you take some ashes and you have water, you can build clay. And if you can build clay, you can build something. And that's how they've sort of approached this unfathomable loss of a child for so many of us. And we can take those lessons and whatever we're going through or suffering, we can apply them. So that's why so often my podcast touches on true crime, but it's really truly just about interesting people.
That's fantastic. I want to ask you, Jayson, and it's kind of a twofold question. Um, First, when did you know you had the gift for interviewing people?
I don't think I have the gift for interviewing people.
Okay. Well,
But people tell me
Figured
that.
it out yet.
Right. I haven't figured it out.
you,
No, I mean, I remember being on maybe it's a lesson I learned, but I forget. But I remember being on the podcast a couple years ago, and I was on with Kimberly Loring, and this is a case that I've taken a lot of interest in. Ashley Loring, Heavy Runners case. She was a 20-year-old girl who disappeared in Montana on the Blackfeet Reservation. I was interviewing her sister, Kimberly, and we had finished recording. And, we were just talking a little bit afterwards. And she said, the one thing I want to tell you before I go is that God gave you a gift, and it was interviewing. You're really good at what you do. And I came back into the office the next day and I was like, this was such a great compliment. It's the first time I've heard that. And my assistant turned to me and she's like, well, that's like the 15th time I've heard you tell me that someone had said something along those lines. So, and maybe in that process of not always believing necessarily I'm good at interviewing, maybe that adds some intentionality to what I do, and maybe that helps with it. If that does that make, I mean, did I answer your question?
I think you answered my question, and it kind of leads to the part two of that I had. You've got the training now as a life coach and some background and work experience in that. So I was wondering if that has how it may have influenced or maybe changed the way you approach an interview of survivors of crime and or the victims of folks who did not survive crime.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm just wondering how that hit for you.
Well, I think it's really interesting. I was talking to a coaching client recently, and when I'm meeting a new coaching client, I share a little bit about my background just so they know my perspective, the lens that I look at the world through. And I was saying I've been a journalist. I had worked, in mental health as a life coach and then done other forms of coaching and also interview people. And I remember when I was first going into clinical work, one of my colleagues saying to me, the hardest part is going to be to get people to open up to you and share sort of like and be vulnerable. And it was interesting because in retrospect, as a journalist, I had a job where I had to get people to open up when they really had no interest in, rarely are they going to get anything out of it. And that made clinical work a lot easier. I also think having been through something that's very difficult, like by my own hand, and also plenty of other difficult moments, has really sort of, I think, softened my approach. And you mentioned to me that we really stuck to the outline that we did. In reality, I I really, if you look at the ultimate podcast episode, we did touch on everything that I outlined, but we went on so many trips in different directions because I really believe as an interviewer that if we completely follow my outline, it's me telling your story. It's those side parts of the conversation where your heart is pulling you that I just need to follow you on because my job as an interviewer is to really just help facilitate saying what you would say anyway. And so it's natural curiosity for me. You mentioned something, um, an aside about growing up somewhere in Virginia. I would spend all day on a farm in Virginia talking about that, even if the whole intention of the interview was to talk about law enforcement, because if that's where your heart is pulling you, that is the most important thing. And so I take that same approach with victims' families. There might be something interesting about a case or an experience that I've read, but if I just let them go where their heart is, what the most important thing to them, we naturally get to the most powerful thing because it's not really about what I'm interested in, it's what they're interested in sharing. And I'm really just a vehicle to help them get to the point where they can do that.
Well, I think it's the passion too, is when you let them go where their heart is, that's where their passion is. And I always say that, that's what people connect to, is that passion. It's contagious.
Hmm.
And so if you're talking and you go off on a something and you're very passionate about it, then your audience, it could be about basket weaving. I don't know. They're going to get into it because they're really into your passion and they're following you. I think you lead with passion.
Well, and we've all listened to interviews where you know the interviewer has like their list of questions, and it doesn't matter what the person says. They're going on to question number three. And it feels like, it almost feels like I just I describe it like I'm driving on the road and somebody just cut someone off as they're like daydreaming and looking at the mountains. You can feel that sort of disruption. And, one of the costs of that is my podcast can be pretty long. I'm never going to be the 45-minute tight conversation because, and I think part of the reason is because, any interview builds, you're actually building trust. Even if you know each other really well, you're building trust in the beginning. And that gives someone an opportunity to sort of be vulnerable. And self-disclosure, I'm very big on disclosing about every little foible about myself or interesting life lesson. Because if I'm willing to be vulnerable, that allows the other person to be vulnerable. I want my podcast to feel like you're overhearing a conversation that me and my guests are having in my living room or their living room.
Yeah. You have a podcast called Silver Linings Handbook. Tell us about that. I'm really interested in finding and hearing where you got the title. It's
Yeah,
an interesting title for a podcast.
well, it's a complete rip off of one of my favorite movies, which is it's kind of a funny story. It's Silver Linings playbook itself. And I don't know if you guys remember that. That was Jennifer Lawrence and Bradley Cooper. And it was this wild story of basically for the two of them with their mental health issues, finding each other and finding sort of like a path, a plan, something that really worked for them. Quirky as it was, but it worked for them in terms of their quality of life. And I've always held on to that idea, I think my entire life, that you can find silver linings in anything, no matter how bad it is. Um, you know, every great lesson I've learned in my life has come through my suffering and through my pain. It's not to say I can't learn lessons in other ways, but the ones that really stick, come from eating that, as Khalil Gibran put it, that bitter poison, right? Of whether you're suffering or your pain. What did he say? He said, "Pain is the breaking of the shell that encloses your understanding, and physician, heal thyself by drinking from that bitter fruit." So I really believe, I really think that there are silver linings in everything. And what's the handbook? Well, it's the collection of all of our stories that other people can listen to and read that really provide roadmaps for other people. And I don't think I've ever had anyone ask me that question, that particular question. So it's really interesting to be able to share what the what the backstory on that is. And the second part of your question was just about the podcast in general. It wildly different guests. I mean, everyone from an FBI profiler to a prosecutor to victims' loved ones to a venture capitalist who's a coach to sex worker to you pick your category of person in the world, and I'm trying to talk to them, whoever they may be.
You know what I noticed, Jason, is because of me doing over 30,000 plus interviews or 40,000 plus interviews in 15 years. I see what you do. You enjoy it where you can know a little bit of background, but you want to learn about that person. You don't want to be told before the interview what's everything about that person. You want to really, and some of the questions you have prepared totally get thrown out the window once you see and get that follow up question. And you say to yourself, oh, okay, this is where I want to go.
Yeah, like
This is that you can't prepare for what could happen.
yep. Yep. And I think, I mean, the one caveat I'd throw on that is sure you can prepare, but the reason why you prepare is so you got a plan when all of that goes out the window. So it becomes less of a plan than just a bunch of tools you have around here.
Right.
Yeah.
And then it's the follow-up question. And a lot of people aren't good at that follow-up question. They answer it and go to the next question. And you brought this up earlier, and I think it's such an important part of it is once you have that vibe going, that's why you do longer interviews. You don't know what to expect next.
Yep.
And you want to get as much out of an interview, interviewing that person than anybody else does because everyone's doing the podcast scene now. And you don't want to ask the same question over and over and over again. I think the challenge is when you have someone back again to make sure you go away from exactly what you talked about before, even if it was 7 years ago or 9 years ago, because you want to learn something next about that person.
Yeah. And recognizing that there's a tremendous amount of growth. People can look at the same events in their lives through completely different lenses at different points. And I've always thought that part of it, like when I have people come back on, it's so fascinating to see the areas where they've grown between interviews. And so I think it's also really important not to presume much about people. What's the data? They say what, 50 minutes is ideal for podcast
The
interview?
reason they're longer and longer now is for
Hmm.
clips. That's
Yeah,
the
it's for
only
clips.
reason. It's the only reason because people have a short attention span. They can't,
Hmm.
and now more than ever, if you are a really good podcast clipper, you're going to have more opportunities to be seen and known. And a lot of people create podcasts not for the podcast, but for the clips.
Clip piece of it. Yep,
And
yep.
that's I mean, like some of these podcasts are valued at 30 million, 90 million. The one that OpenAI bought, the reason they bought it was because of the clips.
Oh, interesting.
It wasn't because of the podcast itself. Yes, the guests were kick butt, all those different things for OpenAI to buy it. But ultimately it's the clips. There's another business podcast that's worth 30 or 40 million dollars, and their downloads aren't that big. It's because of the clips are getting millions of views. So you have
Mm,
to be able to ask a question. And I was telling Jen and Sherrie this that is going to lead to a conversation discussion. The problem is lots of socials pushed is controversy.
yeah.
So you got to make sure that you have two audiences involved in this, some that agree with you and some of you who disagree with you. And you never know what type of clip is going to get that
Yeah.
information.
Yeah. Well, and I have these moments when I'm doing an interview where, can we pause for a sec, just real quick?
Yeah.
Are you hearing that beep?
No, no, it's very low. Don't worry about it. Let's
Okay,
keep
so
going.
it's not
Just keep
messing
going.
up.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Great. So I don't want to screw up your clips.
No, you're not going to. You're not going to screw them up.
Good,
Keep
good,
going.
good.
Yeah.
Um, So I think one of the things for me, when I'm sort of like thinking about the way that I do it, there are these moments, and even, in all my interviews, where I sort of say that's the money quote. And there are a couple things that I've noticed that are in common. It's when the subject of the interview starts to pause and really has to process, and I know they're thinking and they're now off their script and they've kind of been stumped by something. What almost always comes out of that is some of the most powerful stuff that they're processing in the moment, the new revelation or the new idea. So I actually, in my podcast, my editor doesn't cut out the pauses, the ums, we might cut out something crazy we say,
Mhm.
or the dog barking in the background, or whatever it is, because I really do think those human moments, like a pause, sometimes says something even more powerful about someone's emotions than the words that they actually use.
Agree. All right. Go ahead, guys.
Well, Jayson, another thing you've done is you've written a book. You're an
I did. I
author.
got a funny story about that one.
Well, I think that the title's interesting, Burning Down My Master's House, but you can
I
tell us
can,
about it, but I'm kind of eager to hear your funny story first.
yeah, so okay, so what the book is about, it's about my time at the New York Times. And one piece of advice that I give everyone, I'm like, when you go through a big scandal, because some of these big scandal people I'll talk to, I'm like, wait about like 7 years, because that's about when you're going to have your first revelation about it, like your first real big understanding. So it takes time to understand, and to grow, particularly when you've been through something that feels traumatic for you, right? And so I wrote my book like 1 year after the events had happened. So probably a decade before I should have been putting a pen to paper. So the funny story I tell, the book went out of print at some point along the way, I think, or at least the hardcover book went out of print. And I was going to go talk to a Duke class. I think this was in 2016, 2015. Public policy professor had asked me to talk to a bunch of journalism students who were in graduate school. And I went in, and then, he asked me, "Hey, next time, can you bring a signed copy of your book?" So I come back the next year with a signed copy of the book. And the inscription is, "Bill, please do not read this. Signed, Jayson."
Wow.
Because what I know, I think about, and what I've learned and what I've grown from when it comes to my experience, very little of that did I have it in the first window. But I am a writer. I have a Substack. I edit a true crime Substack, which reminds me, I was going to ask whether you want to write something for us. Um, but I edit a true crime Substack called the True Crime Times with Brett and Alice from the prosecutors. I also have my own Substack that's called The Center Holds, and the whole idea behind that is, we're in such a time of division and turmoil. How do we find a center among us? I'm, a big fan of that idea and that concept, and I'm also writing a book myself. And it's so writing is always a part of my life. I think it's the oldest form of therapy, and it's just so valuable to me to not only be able to do that therapeutic thing for myself, but also to be able to help people too with the writing. So I'm writing about a particular case that I've been following for a while, but it's also a cultural critique about our culture, about society, about how things happen the way they do. And so I love that work. It's deeply meaningful to me. I was talking to a publisher today about it, and he was making the point that, like, well, advances are not what they used to be. And I'm like, I don't really care, because why I'm doing this is for the people who can benefit from it, who can learn from it, the family that's dealt with this, the other families that, if we figure out how to solve some of these societal problems, won't have to suffer for it. So this is a project of love, not a project of money. And I feel like that's true about a lot of the work that I do. It's always been centered on some kind of mission, and as I get older, the mission becomes way more important than anything else.
I like that. That's really good. That goes back to what you're kind of known for in your podcast is the empathy, which I think comes from life experience, one, and two, probably your upbringing, and then three, the training that you've gotten is to being a life coach. Because I don't think without some empathy you could be a life coach.
You wouldn't be good at it,
No,
and
not really. Yeah,
you also wouldn't enjoy it, probably.
but
I mean,
I think that too goes back to a lot of times true crime kind of gets the criticism for exploiting somebody's tragedy, and I believe that it depends on how it's presented as to
yeah.
how it's presented there, and so I can see that in your focus with your podcast, that you focus on the survivor or the victim of
Yeah,
lost
yeah.
someone.
And I also, I care about, for example, the investigators, but
Right,
what I think I care more about is them as humans
right.
who made a choice, who are human beings, and we get so used to not thinking of them as humans, right? Because they're in this character of this mold. So I do care about all of those people who are behind it. I don't want to drive past the part about upbringing, but you're absolutely right. My mother and father, they were great. They moored in us wonderful values. They gave us opportunities to go out and make all of our mistakes and all that fun stuff. But I do think it's really I think shaped my approach. But we met at CrimeCon. A lot of people have a hard time with CrimeCon because they view some of it as exploitive and problematic in other ways. And I'm not saying it's perfect from my perspective, but there's a spectrum. But what I find is the vast majority of people at CrimeCon really care about the cases. They really care about people. They're deeply invested in helping survivors and other things along those lines. Now, I do get their problematic elements, but I have this friend, Raul Montero, if you ever heard of Catch Lisk. He's one of the people who has just been most aggressive on getting justice for the girls at Gilgo Beach and for other girls who have gone missing and men who have gone missing, girls, women, and men and boys who have gone missing in that Long Island area. And he's built this amazing database. It's got 35,000 entries of
Wow.
missing or unidentified people. Highly recommend it. Catch List Matt. Law enforcement has used it. He doesn't talk about this much, but it's been used to actually solve some cases. It's been successful in solving some cases and looking for patterns. And but Raul, when we first met, he said to me that, and I interviewed him for the podcast, but he said to me that true crime is a gateway for sensationalism and for monetization. And I said, Raul, actually, true crime is the gateway drug for helping. You know, when I meet people who come into true crime for whatever reason, right? They could be coming into it for whatever reason, their own personal experience with crime, their own anxiety about the world, wanting to be able to help. Well, what I find is so many of those people then become the warriors, supporting these families, trying to educate people, doing all these good things in the world. And so I think we can look at the negative of true crime, which, like I have a Substack where we do that often. But I think there is so much more good in my experience that comes out of it. I can't tell you the number of people I've seen come in as true crime creators, no law enforcement experience, who are going and doing investigative genetic genealogy now, or they've joined a DA's office, or they've done something, they've advocated, or they've sent a $5 gift card to a family that's looking for their lost family member. Like, that stuff matters. And I really do think true crime opens the door to a lot of that.
Thank you, Jayson.
You're welcome. Thanks for asking that.
All right.
And I agree. And I do know that people who are survivors, and especially, somebody who's been killed, they really want to keep, they don't want anybody to forget,
Yep.
you know. And I think true crime keeps these people, and they turn them into names, into people, because they'll
Yeah.
put faces with them. And so people can actually see what this person looked like and everything. So I think, when it comes to something like that, the family members are just so happy and glad that somebody's paying attention and they haven't forgot their loved one.
I think it's a great point because I really believe that your first death comes when you die, and the second death comes when you've been forgotten. And I really believe that for a lot of these families, and also for me as a podcaster and an interviewer, I don't want them to be forgotten. I don't want that second death. So many of them suffered in the first one in some way, or there was some kind of injustice related to the first one, but we can keep them alive.
Yeah.
Very much. I'm very, very big on the never forgot. That's actually the 37th chapter in my book. That's
Yep.
the final chapter. The never forget, the never forgotten. So
Yeah. Yeah. I used to work with murder victims, and I just remember how they would come up to me and say, "Thank you for not letting my daughter go forgotten."
Yes.
Thank you. And the emotions that I would get from them. And knowing people in that situation, just let's keep remembering them, because they lost them unexpectedly, and they're still heartbroken.
It's
I
funny
think later.
too, like thinking about people who are investigators or lawyers or other folks. I think sometimes don't even realize that just being on the other side and spending a lot more time with, you know, just like we struggle to look at law enforcement as people sometimes, I think sometimes if law enforcement knew how much it warmed the heart of a victim's family member that they just spent 10 minutes that day thinking about their loved one. I mean, it is huge. It is really huge and it's meaningful. And I think almost, I don't want to say, it's different for different people. But I do think resolution is very important for people, but knowing that people care is like the next best thing in between and sometimes even more important.
I have to agree, without a doubt.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So where can people find your book?
Um, Hopefully only in a trash bin. If we're talking about the old book. Check your local shredder. I mean, that book's available on Amazon, available other places. I don't know how long it's going to take me for the new book. I'm 3 years in, and it might be 3 more years. So, um, but the podcast certainly is available. Silver Linings Handbook.com is the spot for that. On Substack, the True Crime Times, too, if you have any listeners who like to write. We're really big on having guest essays in addition to the people who regularly write from us. And we've had everybody from victims' family members to prosecutors to defense attorneys to investigators write for it, advocates. So that's another one. And then my other Substack, The Center Holds, it's more analytical and out there and whatever wacky idea is on my head. But any of those places are great places. And certainly if anybody has suggestions about guests that they would like to hear from, I'm not afraid to reach out to anyone in the world to have a conversation if they're willing to have a real conversation.
I got an idea for you, but I'm gonna give it to you afterwards.
Let me know.
I'll email it to you.
Perfect.
Awesome. And where can people find you to reach out to you?
Yeah. Oh, it's Silver Linings Handbook Pod at gmail.com. Also, if you ping me on social media, you can find me that way. Might take me a little bit longer. The email is the fastest way. But I try to check all the secret hidden message boxes every now and then.
Awesome.
There you go.
Cool.
All right. All
Yeah.
right. Thanks again. And go to storehousemediagroup.com for all things publishing, ghostwriting, and media. And lastly, go to jenniferclarkeskew.com to purchase her book. Appreciate it, guys. That was the special Travelcast, the Neil Haley Show, the Storehouse Media Group podcast, and Criminally Good with Jen and Sherrie. Take care.